live to serve all believers.
From the murky depths I come.
I live to serve all believers. I live to serve all believers.
Death to all who oppose the Horde!
It feels good to be in the wilds.
From the murky depths I come.
I smell magic in the air.
I live to serve all believers.
From the murky depths I come.
The game is starting.
Game started.
I laugh in the face of danger!
I have returned.
Some.
Beware, I live.
All right, who wants some?
Beware, I live.
I kill for you.
Of course. A sound plan.
Wait till you see me in action.
Which way?
Is there danger?
Aye?
Of course. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. A sound plan. I stand for the light.
Welcome to our
Justice shall be
village.
done. The light is my strength. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
Give me something to do.
Is there danger? Certainly. Sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. A sound plan. Of course. The light is my strength. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger?
First blood.
I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Our warriors have engaged the
Of
enemy.
course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light. For my father and king. Found me. Of course. Justice. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Found me. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. The light is my strength. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. I'm here to help. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Betrayal of the light. For honor. I stand for the light. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Found me. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. The light is my strength. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. The light is my strength. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. For Lord Ricin. Betrayer of the light. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Justice shall be done. Of course. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. I stand for the light. sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course. Is there danger? Certainly. The light is my strength. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done. Of course. Certainly. The light is my strength. Of course. Is there danger? For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. The light is my strength. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. Foul name. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Is there danger? Certainly. Of course. I'm here to help. Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. The light is my strength. Is there danger? For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Our allies'
I
town
stand
needs
for the
help.
light. Of course. Certainly.
Killing
Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Justice. For the light of my strength. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
Our allies' town needs help.
I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. Betrayer of the light. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. The light is my strength. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. The light is my strength. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A
Our
sound.
allies' town needs help.
Of course. Certainly.
double kill.
I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. I stand for the light. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Our allies' town
A
needs
sound
help.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Is there danger? Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. The light is straight. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our
A sound
allies'
plan.
town needs help.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Feel my wrath. For honor. Certainly. Betrayer of light.
Our allies'
course.
town needs
For
help.
honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For Lord Orion. A sound plan. Is there danger? Justice shall be done. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Stand for the light. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Justice is come. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. I bow to their danger. Of course, a sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Light is restrained. Feel my wrath. For honor. Betrayer of the light.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Justice shall be done.
Unstoppable.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
I'm here to help. Is there danger? Certainly.
Killing spree.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
Our
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. I'm here to help. A sound plan. Is there danger? Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. I stand for the light. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. The light is my strength. A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. The light is my strength. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. Of course. For honor. Light is my strength. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. The light. For honor. For my father. Justice is come.
Our allies' town is
For honor. Of course. Is there danger? For honor. Of course. Certainly. Betrayer of the light. I'm here to help. A sound plan. You are past redemption. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Betrayer of the light. A sound plan. Light is my strength. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. I'm here to help you. Justice shall be done. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. For honor.
double kill, killing spree, hat trick.
For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. I'm here to help. Is there danger? A sound plan. The light is my strength. I stand for the light. Justice is come. You are past redemption. Justice is come. For honor. Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. Of course. I stand. Light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Is there danger? For honor. I'm here to help. Of course.
Greetings, my lord.
Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. Plan. For honor. Is there danger? Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. Of course. I stand for the light. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. Of course. I'm here to help.
Hello. Insufficient gold.
Is there danger? For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Killing spree.
Justice shall be done. A sound plan. The light is my strength. I stand for the light. For honor. For my father. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Is there danger? Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Foul knave. Feel my wrath. I stand for the light. Justice shall be done. Certainly. For Lord Orion. You are past beneath. Betrayer of the light. Of course. Foul knave. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. sound certainty.
Dominating.
Sound plan for honor. Of course. A sound plan for honor. Certainty. Of course. For honor. Of course. For my father's name. For honor. I'm here. You are past. For my father's name. Feel my wrath. You are past the devil. Betrayer of the light. A sound plan. Certainty. Of course. For honor. Certainty. For honor. Of course. For honor. The light. Of course.